Cluster analysis finds groups of objects such that the objects in a group will be similar or related to one another and different from or unrelated to the objects in other groups. Cluster analysis can be for understanding the data or utilities such as summarization. In the context of understanding data, clusters are potential classes, and cluster analysis is the study of techniques for automatically finding classes. Examples are grouping related documents for browsing, grouping genes and proteins that have similar functionalities, or grouping stocks with similar price fluctuations. In data summarization, the size of large dataset can be reduced, and the reduced dataset can then be used for other data analysis techniques. Cluster analysis derives the labels from the data, and because of this, it is also referred as the unsupervised classification, which is different from supervised classification, in which class labels are known, and different from simple segmentation, in which students are divided into different registration groups alphabetically, or different from the result of a query, in which groupings are the result of an external specification. The notion of a cluster can be ambiguous. Looking at a number of points, we may wonder how many clusters. There may be 2 clusters, 6 clusters, or 4 clusters. A clustering is a set of clusters, and there is an important distinction between hierarchical and partitional set of cluster. In partitional clustering, objects are divided into non-overlapping subsets or clusters, such that each object is in exactly one subset. In hierarchical clustering, a set of nested clusters are organized as a tree. Each cluster, except the leaves, is the union of its children, meaning subclusters. And the root of the tree is a cluster containing all the objects. And the leaves of the trees are often clusters of individual objects. This is the illustration for partitional clustering. Each object belongs to exactly one cluster. In hierarchical clustering, an object can belong to more than one cluster. We also distinguish other types of clusterings. For example, exclusive versus non-exclusive. In non-exclusive clusterings, points or objects may belong to multiple clusters. An example is a person at a university can both an enrolled student and an employee of the university. The objects can represent multiple classes or border points. Fuzzies versus non-fuzzy. In fuzzy clustering, a point belongs to every cluster with some width between 0 and 1. And the sum of all the weights must be equal to 1. Similarly, probabilistic clustering techniques compute the probability with which each point belongs to each cluster, and these probabilities must also sum to 1. Partial versus complete, and in some cases we only want to cluster some of the data. Heterogeneous versus homogeneous. With heterogeneous clustering, there may have clusters of different size, shifts, and densities. Now talk about types of clusters. There are well-separated clusters, center-based clusters, contiguous clusters, density-based clusters, and described by objective function. A well-separated cluster is a set of points such that any point in the cluster is closer to every other point in the cluster than to any point not in the cluster. The example shows three well-separated clusters. A center-based cluster is a set of objects such that an object in a cluster is closer to the center of a cluster than to the center of any other cluster. The center of a cluster is called a centroid, which is the average of all the points in the cluster. When data has categorical attributes, the center is called a methoid, which is the most representative point of a cluster. The example shows the four center-based clusters. A contiguity-based cluster is a set of points such that a point in a cluster is closer to one or more other points in the cluster than to any point not in the cluster. And the example shows 8 contiguous clusters. A density-based cluster is a dense region of points which is separated by low-density regions from other regions of high density. And the example shows 6 density-based clusters. And finally, clusters defined by an objective function, which are the clusters that minimize or maximize an objective function. We will talk about 3 important techniques that introduce many concepts involved in clustering analysis. The first of all is K-means. K-means algorithm is applied to cluster data points based on data features in K groups. The algorithm is implemented by minimizing the sum of the squared distances between points xn and the corresponding cluster centroid mu k. In this formula, J is the sum of squares of the distances of each data point to the centroid mu k. N is the total number of points, and k is the number of groups or clusters. R and k can be 0 or 1. It is 1 if xn is assigned to group k and 0 otherwise. And need to find R and k and mu k to minimize j. Setting the derivative of j with respect to mu k to 0, then you get this. From here we see the centroid is the mean of all the data points assigned to cluster k. The algorithm is as follows. First, start with any k centroids, and then for n points, assign the point to the cluster of which centroid it is closest to, and then recompute the mean of the centroid. If the centroids change, then go back to step 2. There are pre-processing and post-processing steps. In pre-processing, data needs to be normalized and outlier need to be eliminated. In post-processing, we eliminate small clusters that may represent outliers, and we may need to split loose clusters, meaning clusters with high sum of squared error, and we may need merge clusters that are close and that have relatively low sum of squared error. K-means has problems when clusters are of different size, densities, and of non-globular shapes. also has problems when the data contains outliers. Hierarchical clustering produces a set of nested clusters organized as a hierarchical tree and can be visualized as dendrogram, which is a tree-like diagram that records the sequences of merges and or splits. With hierarchical clustering, we do not have to assume any particular number of clusters, because any desired number of clusters can be obtained by cutting the dendrogram at the proper level, and they may correspond to meaningful taxonomies. There are two main types of hierarchical clustering: agglomerative and divisive. Agglomerative type, we start with the points as individual clusters, and then at each step merge the closest pair of clusters until only one cluster left. In divisive type, we start with one all-inclusive cluster, and at each step split the cluster until each cluster contains a point. Traditional hierarchical algorithms use the similarity or distance matrix. The agglomerative clustering algorithm is popular. The basic algorithm is straightforward. First, we compute the proximity matrix, then let each data point to be a cluster, and then repeat. We merge the two closest clusters and then update the proximity matrix until only a single cluster remains. The key operation is the computation of the proximity of two clusters, and there are different approaches to define the distance between clusters, and that distinguishes the different algorithms. Let's look at the illustration. We start with clusters of individual points and also a proximity matrix. After some merging steps, we have some clusters, and we want to merge the two closest clusters, C2 and C5, and update their proximity matrix. And that's a question: how do we update the proximity matrix? Cluster proximity is typically defined with a particular type of cluster. For example, mean, max, and group average come from the contiguity-based. Mean defines the cluster proximity as the proximity between the closest 2 points that are in different clusters. Max takes the proximity between the farthest 2 points in different clusters to be the cluster proximity. Group average defines cluster proximity to be the average pairwise proximities of all pairs of points from different clusters. When using the centroids, the cluster proximity is commonly defined as the proximity between the cluster centroid. An alternative technique, the Watts method, also assumes that a cluster is represented by its centroid, but measures the proximity between the two clusters in terms of the increase in the sum of squared error that results from merging the two clusters. Like k-means, Watts method attempts to minimize the sum of the squared distance of points from the cluster centroids. For the single link or mean version of hierarchical clustering, the proximity of two clusters is based on the two most similar or closest points in the different clusters. It can be seen that point 1 and 2 are closest and can be merged together. Looking at the column for point 3. Point 3 is closest to point 2. So point 3 is merged next, as you can see in the dendrogram. And that is a hierarchical order. And in the algorithm, it actually look for the next closest points. And they are for point 4 and 5. And 4 and 5 can be merged together. And 3 can be merged with 1 and 2. And then that cluster and the other cluster are merged together in one cluster. The mean version can handle non-elliptical shapes, but sensitive to noise and outliers. In the mixed or complete linkage version, similarity of two clusters is based on the two least similar points in the different clusters. In the proximity table, we can see point 1 and point 2 are closest, so we merge them together. Point 4 and 5 are closest next, so we merge them together. How about point 3? We look at the farthest point from point 3, which is point 1 in the cluster on the left, and the other farthest point, point 5, on the cluster on the right. So we can see point 3 is actually closer to the group or the cluster on the right. So point 3 is merged to the cluster on the right. The mixed version is less susceptible to noise and outliers. However, it tends to break large clusters. For example, here, the points are closest to the points on the other cluster than the points, the farthest points on the large cluster. So they become green. They become blue and biased towards globular clusters. In group average version, proximity of two clusters is average of pairwise proximity between points in the two clusters. Group average version compromises between single and complete link. The strength is it is less susceptible to noise and outliers, however biased to globular clusters. In Watt's method, similarity of two clusters is based on the increase in squared error when two clusters are merged. It is less susceptible to noise and outliers, but biased towards globular clusters. And this method can be used to initialize k-means.